All right, I think we're ready to rock. Back to many people online. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Can we do welcome to the EMS Council work group on ambulance safety. Can we do a roll call and everybody introduce themselves?
Yeah, let's go around the table and do a few introduction, and then I'll read off the people's names online and then make a map if anyone is on cell only. My name is Shelley Biffle. I work at the Bureau of EMS and Trauma System, and I am support coordinator.
Erin Henderson, CEO and paralegal.
Brian Hubble, CEO and Bridge Program Manager for the Bureau.
Hi, my name is Tim Pike. I'm the Ambulance Services Section Chief.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ethan Yanowski. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Bureau of EMS and Trauma System.
Got Price Fire Department, EMS Precision Chief.
Sean Morkert, Better Health.
Corey Mason Fire.
Gail Bradley, Medical Director, Bureau of EMS Trauma System.
Rachel Garcia, Bureau Chief of EMS and Trauma System.
Good afternoon, folks. Dewey Anderson, Regional EMS Coordinator with the Bureau of EMS.
Maureen Adlin, I am the Trauma and Pre-Hospital Coordination Section Chief. Thank you. And
Online, we've either got Al or AI, Alicia Bromer, Amber Wright, Antonia Gerard, Chris Rogers, David Harden, Forrest Taylor, Jim Roeder, Jordana Carpenter, Josh Gaither, Julia Vinton, Margot Vinson, Marissa Salgado, Matt Shaw, Robin Hout, Rod Reed, Roy Royal, Sandy Nygaard, Steve Foster, TJ McKay, Todd Hermel, Tom Shannon. And is there anyone on the phone only that wants to chime in their name?
Heather Miller's on, Shelley.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, this is JT Antone. I'm on the phone.
First gamer, I just jumped on. Sorry, I'm late.
Oh, hi, Karen. Great.
well, thank you for coming. When Rachel asked me to facilitate this meeting, I have to admit I wasn't really paying attention to when the work group was formed. So I was like, sure, I'll do it. What am I doing now? Yeah. So initially we were looking at ambulance training. Okay, so you may have gotten an email out that said EBOC training, and that went out. I was like, well, wait a minute, we can't use EBOC because that's specific training with a patented name. Okay, so we changed it to ambulance safety. So with ambulance safety, me being me, went down an ambulance safety rabbit hole, and I said, I got this, I've been, I have been in EMS almost 40 years now. I've been on an ambulance for a fairly long time. And so what I'm going to share with you is, the rabbit hole that I went down. And then also I shared my slides with Rachel, and she said, well, what about the two statutes that we're supposed to talk about? I was like, so the two statutes are on the first slide so that I wouldn't forget to talk about them. And basically they are the new statutes that are going into effect January 1st, and which will now have, we've always had EMR in our, in the statutes, but now there's a training component of that. The training component basically says that the emergency medical responder can be the ambulance driver if they have an EMR certification or the training that they have is approved by their medical director. Currently, we do not have rules in place, for this. So come January 1st, but this has always been allowed anyway. It'll probably be, should we decide to adopt a certification, that discussion hasn't really happened yet, and have training for it, formalized rules for it, that wouldn't take place for at least 2 years, the way our, rules go. And if, we've been paying attention to the other rules that we have going on, sometimes much longer than that. So what we want to do is bring awareness to, this is, probably going to be more prevalence. It is for a ambulance service that has a population of less than 10,000. But then we also thought it was like, well, you know what? It's usually those communities where the resources are pretty sparse. So in the meantime, the Bureau could potentially, depending on what this group recommend, is provide resources maybe on our website. And then when I went down my rabbit hole, I realized I know there's a lot that I don't know. There's more that I don't know than what I do know, but I remember from my time working on an ambulance, and I've worked on, worked for 3 or 4 different companies over the years. The training that I got was provided by the services that I worked for. So that it comes to me, it's like, you guys are the subject matter experts, especially when I realized going down the rabbit hole that there's a lot that I didn't know. And I said, well, should they all know this stuff? So we did send out a, what is this, the licensed sirens operation. It's called a joint statement. And it's all about, maybe EMS providers could decide not to use lights and sirens on 911 calls. There is nothing in the state of Arizona that says you have to have use. It's completely up to the providers. And with this physician statement, basically, not physician statement, but it's a joint statement. Basically, it says that they don't make a difference. On the studies that they've done, it doesn't really make a difference. Maybe 3 minutes, and it's not gonna change patient care. But the only thing that I noticed with this is that it's all based on EMD training, emergency medical dispatch training. So I was like, do we have that in Arizona? Another thing I didn't know, so I still don't know. Is that, and so that's what we need from this work group. I want to make this more of a conversation than anything else. So that's what we need from this work group. No idea what the training is for dispatchers in Arizona. Should we consider going that, or should you consider, because, there's nothing in statutory rule, we don't regulate that with these lights and sirens, with the physician statements, what kind of training do the dispatchers have that you receive? I don't know what EMD training is. One is,
I can say from our perspective, and I believe Phoenix followed the vanilla model, we don't use the EMD format, which is a license. This is how we deliver, but all of our dispatchers do receive some basic medical training to be prepared for triaging calls. But we don't use, like, our dispatch center, and I can Phoenix is I can speak to that. They don't use Clausen, which is a canned, right, how you triage calls. We built our own dispatch protocol through our medical direction, and then they do receive some basic.
And that's a service that I work with later on that use the Clausen cards, and it's, but like that, I can, because I was moving around on the different, PSEP websites, and I didn't see EMD certification, so I don't know anything about that. One of the things that I never did in my career was dispatch. I'm dyslexic, so that probably isn't a good idea. I'd be sending ambulances all over the wrong place. So,
Yeah, we can ask if anyone on the call.
Is anybody on the call? Like I said, what we need is input, from this group to say, what are we doing? Because a lot of this areas that we're not.
So, from a bureau perspective, I think if no one on the line is going to make any suggestions on it, just to make sure, EMD stands for emergency medical directions, and those emergency medical dispatch.
Right.
I've always understood it to be directions provided by a dispatcher, but basically it's directions provided by a dispatching entity for when they receive a call when somebody needs CPR, and the person making the call at the scene isn't familiar with CPR or what to look for in terms of how that person that they're calling 911 for is breathing. The Bureau did some research into that several years ago and actually worked with dispatching entities to roll out EMD instructions and training and see what the difference was in patient outcomes between where EMD was used and where it wasn't. It was a really, really helpful study that I think Micah Panzik was involved with. It was effective, and I think that research is still out there and can be used. And I don't remember how they went about the training, but I think the information is still there. And some of the folks out there that were involved in that may be on the line. And if you were, it would be really interesting to hear what your thoughts are on it if you were involved. And if not, we can talk to the dispatchers that were.
I like that, Ethan. So Shelley, I know you have some slides too to tee up, and Ethan, I can't see that far. They're hands raised. Yeah.
Keep the hands raised.
The Fansel, go ahead.
I think that was a partial name that was up there.
B. Sansel.
Elise. Sanciel? Is it Ben Sanciel from Phoenix? That could be Dr. Daver too.
We see someone with your hand raised if you wanted to unmute yourself.
My hand's not raised, but I'll throw in a comment here. When you're talking about EMD and pre-arrival instructions, I think the use of pre-arrival instructions for the victim and the caller on what to do while ambulance is en route or while EMS is en route is the benefits for that are clear. But I think what you're getting at is does a dispatch guideline state whether a unit should be going code 2 or code 3 to a scene? Is that what we want to modify?
We're we're not really looking to modify really anything with this. We're really looking for for feedback from this group. And it's EMR kind of prompted that, we'd like to really think about providing resources like on our website or something like that, like best practices, for safety. There's a few things that have come to our attention. Ambulance crashes. There's some studies that Dr. Harden is going to share later, some statistics. Although Arizona is fairly decent when it comes to, not having a lot of injuries. We can always do better. So with the thought of emergency medical responders, what kind of training would we recommend they have? My point being is that the training that I had was always provided by my provider, and I don't know if, from my perspective only, not the Bureau, that we need to, regulate that as much, only because, very expensive vehicles, safety is an issue. And, if your vehicles are like $250,000, you don't let somebody that has just gotten their driver's permit drive your Lamborghini. So you wouldn't let them, same thing. I mean, ambulance services are very aware of this. You're worried about the safety. So if we would put some, training on our website, what's available out there? Because I don't know. I don't know what, obviously I'm sure that everybody in the room provides training for their employees on driving. When I did it, it was defensive driving. There's EBOC, which is actually behind the wheel. So what's out there? What did you do? And is there something that we can share or something that we can come up with for best practice?
Chris Rogers with a hand raised. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So I'm with VFIS and I work in risk control. I actually, Arizona is one of the states that I work in. I'll kind of give you the suggestions that we have. We're a nationwide company, so we deal with agencies across the country, and so we've kind of modeled our training to try to fit agencies that are small, 10, 15 employees up to larger, much larger agencies. But what we have developed is based on a program that goes back about 30 years. It was initially called EVDT, which is Emergency Vehicle Driver Training. It was very fire heavy, but because we realized that we had so many accounts that were strictly EMS, that in around 2017, we developed a program called EMSVO, so Emergency Vehicle Operations. What we suggest is to do an initial training that includes a classroom component, and then go behind the wheel. To go back to the Lamborghini statement that was mentioned earlier, you know, we have a lot of people coming into the service that haven't driven vehicles at all, or haven't driven vehicles this big. I know that when I was 16, the first thing I did was I wanted to run and get my license so I could drive. My niece, who turned 16 not too long ago, completely different mindset. So I don't think there's the amount of experience coming into the service behind the wheel of vehicles, and especially when we get to vehicles this size. So I think that shows you how much that we need to have an initial driver training program, but we don't just need to train them once and then let them go. We also suggest to do something on an ongoing basis, preferably every year. I know that that's not feasible for every organization, but you know, that each year that could be do the classroom component or do the behind the wheel component, but do something on an ongoing basis. And then don't forget to factor in motor vehicle record check as part of this program, because if you have someone who's driving, you know, their personal vehicle and they have 5 or 6, you know, speeding citations, it's not a big stretch to think that they're going to drive possibly worse when they get into a vehicle that they're not financially responsible for. So whenever we come out and do surveys, those are some of the things that we talk about. How do you select your drivers? How do you train your drivers? And then what are the response guidelines when they go out and are running to a 911 team?
Hey, Chris, this is Dewey Anderson with the Bureau. I just have a very, very quick question. With the proposal of down the road having emergency medical responders in communities less than 10,000 or CONs with less than 10,000 population, from your standpoint, what kind of liability is there as far as an age limit for drivers? And does that make a difference at all?
So at DFIS, we don't have, 18. We started 18. We don't have the 21. We're very much a proponent of letting you decide who drives your vehicle, but we give you some best practices to get you there. If you were a client of DFIS, we don't have a single clue who's driving your vehicle. We don't ask for a name or a driver's license number for the individual, but we do give some best practices as far as driver selection and driver training and things like that. So if you know, EMS it has a huge staff shortage right now. So if you think that there's someone who's 18 years old that you vetted and you think that they are qualified to represent your agency and drive your vehicle, because it's like the individual said earlier, you know, these things are $250,000, $300,000 now, and it takes 3 years to get a new one. So we certainly want to make sure we vet and go through the proper procedures. But if you're comfortable with them representing your organization and your community, then from our perspective, 18 is fine.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead. I need to get off mute.
Can you hear me now? No?
Yeah. Yeah.
I heard somebody.
That's Vince.
B. Santel.
Yeah, can you hear me okay now? I've been having some this Google Meet. Sometimes the city computers don't allow you to click stuff, so I've been maneuvering through some things, and it looks like it's unclicked. So you can hear me. We're
What's
good,
your name?
right?
Tell us your name.
So it's Benjamin Santillan. I'm the deputy chief that oversees our dispatch room of the Phoenix Fire Department Regional Dispatch Center.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. So so back to the EMD as far as training goes, right? So as right now, we're actually revamping all of our training, not only for our dispatchers, for our leads and our supervisors and within our room. We do look at ABCO, which is international, as far as what kind of oversees best practices when it comes to dispatchers and the PSAPs in itself. So we serve as a secondary PSAP to the Phoenix Police PSAP as the primary. When we go through our EMDs, and this is what I've learned very quick, is a lot of the EMDs are specifically, so we dispatch for 30 jurisdictions, right? So in these EMDs, they're constantly evolving, right? So we look at these as far as what best suits our customers is what we're trying to achieve. So when you look at our training program, even when as dispatchers, there's basic introduction, there's legal liability that goes in EMD, there's introduction to emergency medical concepts, there's obtaining information from callers, because your EMD is merely interesting if you don't know what the nature of that particular call is. So there's so much that goes into EMD protocols. Also to your resource allocation, right? So depending on what city you are in, you have different capabilities in different situations for particular calls, right? So to know EMD, you have to know your resources as well, but also how do you provide those instructions? Like you said, all of our folks are CPR certified up in the alarm room. We do have some paramedics. We also have some EMTs. So their scope begins to open up a little bit more. But the other thing too, we always understand as far as our EMDs is our nature codes. So we have quite a few nature codes, but also we have our chief complaints as well. So everything is constantly evolved right now. Like I said, when it comes to training, that was just the basic of what we introduce all of our dispatchers to. Now it becomes evolving that training every year. So there is a standard of, I believe it's 12 to 24 hours. However, here at Phoenix Fire Regional Dispatch Center, we actually exceed that. So we are actually, like I said, redoing all of our training. So our EMDs are up. We work closely with our EMS division, with Dr. Gamer, but also we look at the best practices with all the other particular medical directors as far as how they most definitely do what they do in their city. So I hope that answered a couple questions, but like I said, there's a lot that goes into EMD that I can say, and I think we're just touching the surface.
Thank you for that. When I attended a subgroup of NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety, the EMS component, one of the things that they pointed out in that group is that less than 50% of the dispatchers in the country are EMD trained. I was really surprised about that. So, and that's the rabbit hole that I went down was, you know, and but I don't know that.
On that though, and I want to point out, our dispatchers are not EMD trained because we don't use that protocol. That's a canned training system that you can go in and get a certification as an emergency medical dispatcher. It's a certification. All of our dispatchers, to Ben's point, in the Phoenix system, the Mesa system, all of them do get basic EMS training as dispatchers, and then their protocols line out, like you said, they all know CPR. We do have some that have been EMTs or some that have even been paramedics, but they do get a basic dispatch level training on how a dispatcher needs to be able to manage medical emergencies. We just don't use the proprietary certification, which is EMD, and a lot of fire departments and EMS agencies across the country have gone different paths. There's more than just the EMD certification that can give you that. It's just the most common that people have heard of. So I don't think that our dispatchers don't have medical training. They absolutely do. We just didn't choose to use that EMD, which is a copyrighted certification system.
Corey, is a better phrase for pre-arrival instructions?
Yes, if you call it pre-arrival instructions, yes, all of our dispatchers in the Metro Phoenix area, and I would wing it to say any of them that have a fire-based dispatch system all have that.
And I would imagine they do triage too, because, you know, quite often you probably have more calls than you have ambulances for. So they have to triage who is the most serious or critical that needs to go first, or no.
No, so that would be a no too.
Oh, really?
Because of the way the automatic gate system is set up, which is very different than most places in the United States. And because of the way it's been set up for 40 some years in the metropolitan Phoenix area, essentially I would say, I don't want to say it's never ever happened, but we have I would say almost an unlimited amount of resources, to the point where if all heck is broken loose across the west side of the valley, Scott would get a Mesa unit responding in a surprise. Like, that's how the system is built. So no, we don't have a triage level where we say, we don't have a resource to send, so you're going to go in the queue. That would be more like, and Ben can chime in here as well, that would be more like on the PD side of the world. The PD side, those dispatch centers absolutely do queue calls and say, we don't have a resource to send, so you're going to go in the queue. On the fire side, we send a resource.
Okay.
I don't want to say it's unlimited, because obviously there is limits, but we do send a resource. Since all of our fire trucks have 2 paramedics and 2 EMTs, does that necessarily mean it's going to be an ambulance? No. That does get triaged based on our dispatch protocols.
And go ahead.
Chief, you're absolutely correct. And that's what I was saying is like, with these particular PSAPs, our dispatchers are pretty amazing folks. Like, as far as just knowing, because it's a big system that works together, but it all just depends on the capabilities of particular units, right? So we send accordingly to what those natures are, and also to the EMD protocols as far as what stuff, because some things can go to telehealth, right? So there's just so many avenues that I think our dispatchers, because it's, fire based and being that secondary PSAP, it's really gives us the ability to do many things that a lot of others are not privy to be doing, if that makes any sense.
No, absolutely.
And
Thank you for that.
Thank you for that background too, to consider how emergency medical dispatch training and pre-arrival instructions and triage are so important and play a role in this. Shelley, would you be able to advance your slide? I know that there are folks raising their hands from the different region online, and we want to make sure that, one more, Shelley. We want to make sure that we go to the other regions to also hear some feedback. I see Vince Martinez is raising his hand from the northern region. Vince, would you be able to share here any driver training recommendations or other recommendations to be considered?
Yes, but before I do, just going back to EMD, I'm not going to even try to explain what's going on up here, except that we do have our version of EMD with our PSAP here at the City of Flagstaff. And as an ambulance agency, what we really need are 2 things: accurate information coming in from the call taker, and then very accurate prioritized dispatching. So, we use Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. And so, we know that if it's Alpha, everyone's going in, no lights, no siren. Bravo, the closest unit in is going in code 3. The second is not. They're going in just regular driving. And then Charlie, we need 1 paramedic. That's code 3 response from everyone. And then Delta is we need at least 2 paramedics, and we need code 3 response from everyone. And right there, that sets the tone as to appropriate mode of response to those 911 requests. And it really, really is important that the EMD dispatchers are able to discern what is a code 3 drive and what is not, and those appropriate near resources. So that's a priority to us. But getting specifically to ambulance driver training, obviously it goes back to your policies. Every ambulance agency needs to have very, very detailed policies on driving. We're talking about code 3, non-code 3, driving, who drives, and it should include like cell phone and distracted driving policy. What happens when you get in a vehicle accident? I mean, it lays out what you can and can't do with these vehicles, and not all vehicles are the same. We have many types of vehicles, and policy dictates what we can and cannot do with these vehicles. The 4-wheel drive versus the non, the critical care truck that is, it's huge. It requires specialized driver's education. So, someone said it earlier, when you're sitting down with your new team coming in, that you have a very structured, a very detailed driver's education class that goes over policy and the format of before you get in your vehicle, what that education is. And then there's a secondary part, which is that emergency vehicle and driver education where you are going out there and they're learning how to drive these ambulances, which are totally different than their personal vehicles. So I think that's very important to have out there. And, go back to your policies in your agency and you'll see what, hopefully, the gaps in your policies. Thank you.
And Vince, can I echo on what you just mentioned real quick about policies? Is that okay?
Go for it.
Okay, so DFIS on our website at dfis.com. I don't know if we have people that are in the audience that are clients of ours, and then obviously I'm sure there are people that aren't clients of ours. But we do have sample guidelines, and there's no login that's required. So if you go to vfis.com or you go to a website that's called responderhelp.com, Responder Help has a search. We call it Google for First Responders. It's a search engine where you can pull up sample response guidelines. That's a very important piece of the overall driver training component to make sure when you are doing driver training that you're training to respond to those guidelines. Yeah.
If you don't mind, sir, we had two people that were in front of you with their hands raised. I just want to make sure if you have resources for the group, you can definitely share those in the chat part of the Google Meet meeting. But we did have two individuals that had their hands raised for a while. I think we had Rod Reed followed by Dr. Josh Gaither, who oversees Tucson Fires Dispatch Center. So I'd like to hear from both, please.
Okay, that's all I got.
Thank you. Bob, go ahead. And then I know Dr. Gaither, you had your hand raised as well.
Sure, I can go if Rod is trying to get unsilenced. I was going to make two quick points. The first is about, I think, this topic that your slide is up there, your driver training recommendations. My gestalt, listening to the conversation, is that our large agencies already do this fairly well. And that any driver training recommendations this group should develop should really be targeted towards those very rural, under-resourced agencies that are likely to hire an emergency medical responder to be a primary ambulance driver. So maybe we should define exactly who is going to benefit from driver training recommendations, because I think most of our fire-based agencies, as well as private ambulance agencies, do a fairly good job of this. My second comment is around those EMD standards. I think we could go a lot of different directions on this one. Lots of people use different dispatch systems, as we've heard. I think my real thoughts was maybe we should focus on safety by primarily identifying which dispatches might be appropriate for a code 2 dispatch, and really meeting some of our partner NHTSA recommendations to reduce the number of emergent dispatches and increase the number of non-emergent dispatches. I would only add to that, if we try to put EMD training on our rural partners, they're likely not to be able to manage that. It's just something that they don't have the capacity to do in a very resource limited environment. So those are my 2 cents.
Hi, this is Rod. Can you hear me now?
We can, Rod. Thank you. Welcome, Rod.
Okay. So there are basically in the EMD world, emergency medical dispatch, there's APCO and there's International Academies of Dispatch, kind of the 2 main vendors. And then as Mr. Santel pointed out, there's some hybrids out there that have been developed by those bigger agencies that have the wherewithal to do that. And it is providing pre-arrival instructions and basically triaging the call. You're going to go with lights and sirens. You're going to go normal traffic. However, but it's kind of those two things in it. And I also believe that they should be vetted. And the one that I developed back in several years back was we had a medical director who went through and made sure that all of our pre-arrival instructions were appropriate, and you know how the EMS vehicles funded. And you know, and it was a, you know, and somebody I don't know what it was kind of talked about it being a canned thing. And there is some truth to that, but you take the canned one and you modify it for your jurisdiction, and your doctor has to sign off on that, your medical director. So that's basically what I had. And then the driver training, there's several vendors that do that, you know, obviously including VFIS, and we used a different one. But you know, nobody drives unless they've had the training, and that includes the training is for fire trucks, ambulance, everything we have. There's a training module that you've got to go through. So that's all I had.
I go to Matt Shaw.
Matt?
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to sort of echo what Dr. Gaither said. I really agree with a lot of that. I think EMD, when it's available, is extremely useful, and maybe the best use of this group's time and energy would be, like he had mentioned, focusing on what things should qualify as Code 3 or what shouldn't qualify. I think trying to say that we need to roll EMD out everywhere would be very difficult, even in Flagstaff, which is, I don't know, maybe a medium-sized town. We struggle with getting EMD licensed, certified, whatever dispatchers actually in the PSAP. And so oftentimes we're not able to do EMD on patients for 911 calls. I think the overall focus really should be trying to limit the amount of Code 3 driving that EMS is doing. It is extremely dangerous, as multiple position papers have pointed out. And so trying to focus on limiting that, I think, should really be the goal. And the last comment would be is that while the state doesn't speak specifically to Code 1 or Code 3 driving, all of the CON rules have response time requirements. And so that indirectly certainly forces agencies to potentially respond Code 3 more often in an attempt to meet those requirements. Thank you.
And then Todd, go ahead, Todd.
Yes, good afternoon. Very much as Dr. Gaither said and Mr. Shaw just stated, I would agree as it relates to the Code 3 responses when we were talking about CONs and how they're tracked from a regulatory standpoint. I secondary everything that has been said from Vince as well regarding, I think many of the organizations on here, if not all, do have specific programs specifically to driving protocols, EVOC or whatever you would like to call it. I think the things to be mindful of is different locations, geographic areas. You know, do we spend more time for those areas in the northern part of the county, you know, learning to drive in snow versus maybe in the southern markets or rural markets, learning to drive maybe where there's more sand-based or limited asphalt or roads. I think those are all things that need to be considered or should be considered to be incorporated. I would also like to maybe flip it on its back and look at it from an educational standpoint to the community. Oftentimes we see and hear about these horrific incidents or collisions, often because the community or the members in the community in which we're servicing do not hear the sirens. Times are different today. You have cars that have windows with heavy tint. They're unable to hear things. They're a little bit more soundproofing. You've got people that drive with headphones in or earpieces due to Bluetooth. So a little bit more education to the community about maybe what to look for, maybe scanning intersections very much like this group does and the staff, I think wouldn't hurt. I know there's a big push with media and news around going back to school and slowing down in school zones. Is that something that the Department of Health could start to continue maybe once a quarter, every so often, find it pertinent to work with local media and do things on the news to remind folks of what to look for emergency vehicles? Pulling over is a simple thing that we don't see very frequently. So just ideas or thoughts beyond this group.
That's a great idea, Todd.
Todd,
Thank you for that.
That really is a great idea, and I swear we did not plant Todd's comment, but I do feel like it segues really nicely into what Dr. Harden was going to tee up for us. We wanted to make sure, some of the points you made, Todd, that we were sharing data with the group in terms of the crash rate that we've seen in Arizona. And Dr. Harden can speak to this more eloquently, but as we gather recommendations from this group, we are preparing in November for Crash Responder Safety Week. And perhaps there is some messaging that could be pulled forward, to be put out by the state in partnership with so many of the local agencies. Dave, are you on the line and ready to tee up some of the information that you compiled?
Rachel,
And just a second, Dave, we do have a comment in the room from Mr.
sorry,
Bridle.
I was just waiting for everybody else to finish online. So one of the things that I've found working in the private industry historically have been that we often don't look at what do we do after, and so some of the things I think we should consider, what type of remedial training is available when we do recognize that there's an issue. Additionally to it, do we have annual trainings that we continue to provide that training? What I found from previous employees is complacency often happens to be a big issue when people have been driving for long periods of time on the road and they just don't follow all the rules. So those are some of the things I think we should also consider. In addition to that, do we have a QA/QI process that people could utilize to be able to look at using reviewing drive cams or using technology to be able to capture some of the driving data to help us understand why people are driving the way they are driving?
To your point, from NHTSA standpoint, the fatalities, the large majority of the fatalities involving EMS were non-use of seatbelts.
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly.
Yes.
So there's some messaging that you just remember, if you don't, wear your seatbelt in the back.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Harden, the floor is
Hi.
yours.
Of the chair. Thank you so much. What you see in front of you on the screen here are 8 years worth of crash data compiled from the Arizona Department of Transportation through the crash record system. Now, these are records that are obtained through law enforcement submitting their crash reports to ADOT. This is 8 years of compiled data that deal just with ambulance-involved crashes. Now, for those 8-year period of time, there's 412 total crashes, of which 300, again, the vast majority are property damage only crashes. And then 109 of those crashes had injuries, and then 3 of those crashes were fatal. And what's interesting, there's not much of a pattern or a trend here as far as a total crash count from the 58, 50, 49, 38, 63 by year. What you'll find is that the fatalities occurred in the past 2 years, 21 and 22 is where we saw those fatalities. Now, of those 3 fatalities, one involved the ambulance driver, which you see on the far left side of that screen. And the other involved a bicyclist who was hit by the ambulance, and then the driver of the other vehicle who struck was killed by the bicyclist. So that's all those were over age of 17. And part of this data was utilized to help justify pediatric restraint devices for ambulances for transport. But as you can see, the vast majority are property damage only, not to negate the fact that, property damage isn't serious because there's lots of insurance costs and problems involved with that. But again, 109 injuries and 3 fatalities over an 8-year period. Now, that's not too bad, but again, as you'll find out later in the next few slides, the goal of crash reduction nationally is towards 0 deaths or 0 injuries. So that's what we're going with. Matt had his hand up. Do you have a question, Matt?
Yeah, I was just curious if you had any of this data broken down by time of day. And I know I've read some stuff from ADOT, or not ADOT, sorry, but the DOT looking at nighttime driving being more dangerous. I was just curious if this correlated or not.
That data hasn't been broken down. I'd have to go through the accident crash information system with Arizona to compile that information. I can work with that if that's of value to the work group. So yeah, this was just a summary of the data, just to give an idea that crashes do occur, injuries do occur with ambulances, and there are fatalities involved. But if you want more specifics on that, I can start working with ADOT and compile some breakdown of the times of day, type of injuries involved, so that on and so forth. Can we go on the next slide, Shelley?
Sure.
Now, we're talking about ambulance safety. You could drive as safe as possible and get to the scene on time and to the scene safely. But if you're not part of a traffic incident management or the unified command structure at the crash scene, where you've got barriers and blockades and advanced warnings in place, you're more likely to be struck and killed or struck and injured while on scene. So my recommendation for part of this ambulance safety is include traffic incident management as part of the overall training. As you can see here, the national data from 2017 through the latter part of August this year, I have both on-duty and off-duty fatalities, and they're broken down by the main disciplines that are tracked by the traffic incident management struck by database. The combined total is 238 fatalities over that time period. And the vast majority are law enforcement, fire EMS, and towing recovery. Towing recovery is highest because they tend to hang around after the fire truck's gone, the barriers are brought down. So they're at greatest risk of being struck. They haven't got the lights, they haven't got the barriers to protect them while they're there. So that's why that's such a high number. And then you have the off-duty number. And I'm working on a module for traffic incident management that's going to address ways to prevent those off-duty crashes and fatalities, because about 5% nationally occur when a firefighter or law enforcement are off-duty when they get struck. Next slide. This is the Arizona of the same data. As you can see, we had 8 on line of duty deaths and 2 off-duty deaths with a total of 10 for that same time frame. The majority of those were law enforcement, towing recovery, and those state service patrol vehicles that render assistance to disabled vehicles. Yeah, it's only 8 and 10 respectively, but 20% of those deaths were off duty. So that's one thing to consider as well. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that I think traffic incident management should be part of our mindset. We're talking about ambulance safety. I think there's another slide after this. Rachel had, and wisely so, had mentioned the safe system approach that's being established through the National Roadway Safety Strategy through the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's a national trend, and within that whole safe system approach, there are 5 segments: safe roads, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe road users, and post-crash care. For purposes of this discussion, I indicated on the periphery of the circle, the colors corresponding to the segments where ambulance safety, traffic incident management, and capture of crash data kind of falls in line. And pretty much every one of them you see has an impact on those segments. The idea is the safe system approach is a holistic approach where each one kind of supports the other, kind of a cascading or synergistic approach to reduce the likelihood of crashes occurring. And what the viewpoint for the feds on highway safety is of this scheme is fatalities and serious injuries are unacceptable. Humans make mistakes. Humans are vulnerable. Responsibility is a shared issue. Safety is proactive and redundancy is crucial. So this kind of takes that mind. There's a link up the top there. I'm not sure Shell will be sharing this slide with the group. If that way the links are there if you want to check out that specific program more detail. There you go. Thank you. So I'm looking for any questions. If anybody has any questions for me on this.
Dave, that was great. Thank you for pulling those statistics together. And we can absolutely share this slide deck for anybody that would like to have access to the information that was just shared.
Okay.
These are great links to look at and think about the important role that EMS plays in the safe system approach. And certainly we still want to welcome those recommendations and best practices that you all have to be able to pull forward. I think the next slide, Shelley, is a discussion slide. As we do prepare for EMS Council in September, we wanted to hear from this group what recommendations would be good to be able to bring back to EMS Council. And keeping in mind, I think like we just talked about, that November is National Crash Responder Safety Week, and that is certainly an opportunity to team up with multiple agencies to do some community messaging as well. Great, hand it back to you.
So as far as recommendations, from what I'm hearing is mostly the training is department specific, based on what your needs are. Is there anything that you think that would be beneficial for the Bureau to put on their website? You know, is there any training that you are using either, you know, I mean, you all probably have had defensive driving, you know, is there something, a link or something? What do you recommend?
Well, I can speak for most of the East Valley, and I think I'm hearing that most of the West Valley is using the EBOC program for our ambulance operation. That is much more expensive, I would say, than just the basic defensive driving. Mesa uses a 40-hour EBOC certification program. We have multiple train the trainers and are building a cadre of additional train the trainers from across the East Valley. I would say, I think, speaking from the Tempe, Gilbert, Superstition, Queen Creek, Scottsdale, they went to the 40-hour class as well for their, well, Scottsdale is in the process of their CON, but they have brought on train the trainers in the EBOC and intend to do the 40-hour class if they go down that path. I think we mirrored ours off of surprises because I thought you guys did the 24 and the 40-hour class.
24.
We had some agencies that at least initially were only using either a 8 or a 16-hour. And my perspective on that is too low, because these are ambulances that are driving through all of our cities. Wherever you live, these ambulances are driving through your cities. And I think Mr. Rogers and I think that Todd Armio commented on it, but we are finding younger and younger folks coming into this field. We are hiring 18 and 19-year-olds to drive these ambulances all over the place. Some of them have never driven anything other than the, you know, Honda Civic that they drove up into the parking lot in. So we are putting a lot of money in it, but I also think that what Dr. Gaither said is true. Your municipal jurisdictions, we got all that. We're doing our driver operator training. We have a follow-up. We have ongoing TE that they're required to complete every year. We have a investigations process for any accident that includes mitigation plans that require them to go through additional training all the way up into the point that they lose their jobs. So I think that this is probably a better discussion, to Dr. Gaither's point, is if there's a minimum standard, I would love to see something a little bit more than 8 hours of emergency vehicle training for folks that are driving ambulances across our city, because as we talk about all the time, it's the most dangerous thing that our firefighters do, whether it's riding in the back of them, whether it's driving the ambulances, whether it's our civilian employees. There's a smallest vehicle that we operate code 3 in. So it is a very risky operation. So from my perspective, the training piece, we do like the EBOC program, but I would say that most of the the fire departments and larger agencies doing ambulance operation already have a very robust driver operator training program, a mitigation plan, a follow-up, a safety investigations protocol. They're all of those things are in place for us.
How available is the e-bike? So it's a certification, isn't it?
I can tell you, I'm teaching it about, it feels like every other week. So it's we're hiring all the time. So we built our own, and that's what most of the East Valley agencies did, is they sent their own people. We have within the fire department, and I think even within our private partners, they have driver operator training personnel that we sent them to the trainer, and they are now all certified EBOC trainers. So we're running the classes. I would say easily I can speak to the East Valley all pretty regularly. We're probably teaching across the East Valley 12 or 14 of them a year because we have such high turnover in the transportation operation.
How did that work? I mean, if we were to say, okay, EBOC is recommended because, like I said, there's no regulations in place now. How would we as the Bureau be able to do that? Do you guys allow other agencies to come in? But then what about the vehicles? EBOC is behind the wheel, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
So they have to come. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, how would that work though? If to bring the rural communities, is it something that we can make that available in the central region to the regions?
Yeah, I think we should be probably focusing on the rural side of it. Yeah,
absolutely.
But I just noticed that Amber Wright has had her hand up, and Roy, I think you also had your hand up at one point in time as well. Amber?
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to echo some of the other points from earlier. And if we're trying to talk about recommendations from EMS Council, I agree with what's been said before, that it seems a little bit outside the scope of EMS Council to recommend specific training courses or training timeframes. Most of the agencies work with insurance companies that outline some specific requirements, and they will follow those requirements. And I think as far as EMS Council goes, I think that what EMS Council could focus on would be, like Dr. Gaither had said before, looking at medical necessity of driving code 3 for different call types, and where there could be some best practices put in place to help drive some best practices in that area. But outside of the medical recommendations, I just feel like EMS Council doesn't really, it's not within their scope or purview to recommend specific, operational and driving courses for fire departments and EMS agencies.
And thank you, Amber. Certainly that's something that I would echo. The reason I shared the position statement was this was really sponsored by a number of large national organizations that govern both the EMS as well as the fire-based system, and really kind of recommendations about trying to look at how do we make this more safe, understanding the time frame of how much time do you actually save going code 3 versus code 2. I think the position statement did a really good job outlining that. And so I think those are some actionable items that EMS Council could take back.
Yeah. And Dr. Wright, this is Rachel. Just to add on to, I think that we really wanted to take this opportunity and bring recommendations to the statutory committee that could be reviewed a little bit further and considered for when we do open up rules again in the future. Just linking this back to the fact that we have had 2 bills passed recently that will require that we consider training recommendations and requirements in the beginning of January. So definitely appreciate any feedback and guidance that this group has to be considered at any of the future statutory committees that could be put forward as potential recommendations for rule writing.
All right. Chris, did you have something else?
I just wanted to mention one thing that I think should be considered in the driver safety program is a lot of the data that was presented in those last slides were, after accidents had happened. But I would consider a near miss program if that's something that's not a part of your driver safety program. It's Sometimes it's hard to implement because you do have to rely on the individuals to come and tell you that that you know they almost had an accident but didn't. Driver monitoring systems can help identify some of those things, but we've seen that near misses have helped drive down some of those losses because it starts that conversation before an accident occurred instead of having that conversation about what happened retroactively after an accident.
Shirley, does anyone else on the line have their hand up?
Yep, Vince Martina?
Thank you. Do you ever foresee BEMSTS having the funds to reestablish that program that you had many years ago, where you actually had a vehicle that you would take to the rural areas and practice driving and have tire blowouts? Excuse me. It was very beneficial in the past. It was a very short program, and this vehicle, it was an awesome vehicle. And I know it did cost money, but I felt it was a very successful program, and I was sad when it went away. The other thing is, maybe you could do the a similar thing which you did for the safe transport of children, in the fact that putting it out there for the premier EMS agencies to share their vehicle driving operations policies with each other, at least to start that discussion, to help each other shore up a good policy, you know, because not all policies work for everyone, right? The major urban areas versus the rural, vast differences in vehicles and the type of people that are running those apparatus, but maybe it's a good starting point where we could share good policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. We also have another hand raised. Yes, Hodge bound.
Yeah, you were close. I won't make you do it. So I came from a system in California where basically we had to go through the DNV or NVD and take a ambulance driver test before we could even sit behind the wheel of an ambulance. And this kind of made sure that we understand the rules, regulations of driving code 3, what was necessity for code 3. And then we would go out and we would do our behind the wheel stuff, but you had to get that special endorsement on your driver's license that you had to renew every couple of years, just like your driver's license. So something like that would probably be beneficial if possible, because it can help state some regulations and have them uniformed.
Stephen, I see you printed something. Do you have any of the statutory requirements in front of you?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to the discussion. I know we originally started looking at this from a population of less than 10,000 being served. And while that's what the current statutes read, I want everyone to keep in mind that with House Bill 2609, the language has changed. And as of January, it's going to also include providers who provide interfacility transportation. And so just keep that within our discussion, because it's much more broad than just a population of less than 10,000 being served with the new language. So I think what I'm trying to get across is you may see EMRs being used in metropolitan areas as well as rural areas with this language.
I think the needs are going to be different for the rural providers versus, you know, if you are existing in the Metro Phoenix area. And that's something that we definitely want to recognize and solicit information that would help us understand those challenges in a meaningful way. Roy?
Yeah, I think that's given. The question was what the recommendation is to the EMS Council, and I sit on the EMS Council, and I think it would be most efficacious for the Bureau to gather resources and have a good resource page, whether it be examples of policies and procedures, whether it be emergency vehicle training programs that are available out there either for free or for a price, but offer resources which I think would be the most beneficial for the rural program, for the rural agencies. But the one thing that I have thought about is that, you know, the the largest vested interest in safe ambulance driving is that of the employer of that person. And it really didn't change when we added emergency vehicle responders to the mix, because it's the same sort of risk that ultimately go back to the operator of the ambulance service. So I don't suspect that their training is going to be any different, or is proposed to be any different than the training that they already have, which that they're already providing to their EMTs and paramedics. And I think the data shows that historically the ambulance providers in the state have done a pretty darn good job, whether they be fire-based or private sector, in training their people based on the statistics. So I caution the Bureau again about getting overzealous about a regulatory requirement such as California that was brought up by Vince. And as it relates to the other Vince, I agree with you. The program that was funded by the state was very effective. It was primarily used in the more rural areas because that at that time there was some research that showed that there was some issues, and the primary issue was fire failure, blowouts, etc. And that's how the blowout vehicle was developed and how it was deployed under state contract. And in fact, I was one of the blowout vehicle instructors. So I think all in all, both large and small providers have done a good job because they have a vested interest. And the recommendation that I would hope to see at the council would be we're going to develop a more robust resource for emergency vehicle operations, an encouragement of public notifications or public PR about response to emergency vehicles that are traveling on the roads of the state, as was suggested before, and perhaps consideration of some funding for projects to provide emergency vehicle operation training throughout the state.
Thank you, Vin. I'm sorry. Thank you, Roy. It's really what you're saying is along the lines that we were thinking, because I think somebody also had that point. But, you know, when you think about it, unless things have changed, when you take your EMT and paramedic program, there's no driver training in that. It's provided by your employer or whoever you're working with. And like I said, unless things have changed. Rod?
Yeah, I agree with Roy as far as making those making that available. And going back to the EMD, I mean the ones that I have run numbers on, they're cutting down their emergency responses by 40 to 50%. That's a big number. And the last thing I have is just, you know, if we still got agencies out there that are jumping in the fire truck or the ambulance or whatever they're responding to the EMS emergency with, and that has not been triaged, there's a pretty good chance that they're going emergency traffic for a minor injury that didn't need that. So we should be way past that.
Can I comment on that briefly?
Of course.
You're absolutely right, Rod. But I caution us to accept a one size fits all. What certainly would be appropriate is a code 2 response in the Valley area for some particular diagnostic information that's given at the time of the call. It might be appropriate for a code 3 response in a more rural area. Number one, the risks are typically lower, fewer intersections. And number two, because of the longer on average response time. So what we may count, we may dispatch as code 2 in the valley might be a perfectly appropriate response for code 3 for Timber Mesa, and as an example of way out on the periphery. So just, you know, I'm always cautious about, you know, kind of trying to regulate something that's kind of locks people in. And I realize most EMD programs have the capability of modification or local editing based on local protocols or geography, etc. But I just want to make sure that there is significant differences in even how EMD is implemented in the rural area versus the urban areas. So, but I agree with you. I know I've worked with cities that have adopted EMD in the past, and we saw between a 40 and 60% reduction in code 3 calls, which is, you know, number one, everybody's able to sleep at night because they don't have sirens all the time, or number two, it's a lot safer.
Thanks, Roy. As far as the EMD, we're not really looking to regulate that. That was me, because I just didn't know what you use here in Arizona. So it was more of a, you know, to get information, say, what are you doing? You know, are you using EMD? Is it, you know, because I basically assumed that if you weren't using EMD, there was some kind of, you know, variation of it. You know, for example, American Heart versus, you know, Red Cross, that kind of thing. So, because when I was looking at the recommendation, it references EMD over and over again, and it's kind of like, is that a thing? You know, and then I just wanted more information. So there's no effort to regulate. We're really right now trying to get ahead of these rules when they come into place. And is there any resources that we can provide? You know, as far as regulate, the rules aren't open yet for education and training. They probably will, but not for a while. But in the meantime, you know, is there something the Bureau should do to provide resources so that they're available if needed? You know, so, you know, we're not looking at the regulate part thing now.
Noreen, just to make a point on what you just referenced, Rachel, is part of this meeting, a part of this work group, trying to come up with a recommendation on what an emergency medical responder program will be composed of, and specifically the emergency vehicle driver training aspect of that, and what would be included in that criteria to certify the program.
That would be very helpful if that is the recommendation this group can come up with. And I think what we've heard from several of the folks today is that there are those trainings out there, and otherwise, that are currently used. And we definitely would be interested in creating some sort of a resource page that could be reviewed by EMS Council or one of our statutory committees, and to help inform what those standards are, to your point. I don't know which bill you have in front of you.
2609.
2609. 2609 and Senate Bill 1711 both give the department exempt rulemaking authority for roughly 12 months. And so we would have an opportunity, if that recommendation was made through this work group and through EMS Council, we would have an opportunity to look at giving specific parameters around what is referenced in the statute you have in front of you.
Okay, because it looks like the director is going to have to approve the program, or an administrative medical director approving something similar. And so they're going to have those criteria, including the driver training criteria, down in order to approve it.
We have a hand raised online. David?
I think 2609 has a list of, or a summary of the topics for EMR training. I think 2 or 3 of them were invasive, like blood pressure, glucose, driver training. It's not maybe at least an overview of some of the items that are included in that.
Is it in the slides, Shelley?
You have to click the, there you go. That's it.
Page 4.
Yeah, it's driver training. emergency vehicle driver training.
So to clarify, I think the questions that came up, this is in one of the bills, this is Senate Bill 1711. I apologize, I can't see that far. Thank you. Is this Senate Bill 1711 or 2609? I can pull up, this 2609 I have in this format, but I don't have the 11. And the language should be the same. Currently, while this is listed in statute and will be updated in January when this bill goes into effect, we do not have in rule any specific with respect to emergency vehicle driver training.
So it calls out emergency vehicle driver training, but it doesn't say what that is.
Yes.
So that can be 2 hours of sitting in a classroom, or it can be 40. We got a problem then.
I think that's what we've been trying to get at, is the statute recommends driver training and a program to go along with that. We're looking for the criteria to put in a rule that would flesh out the statute that doesn't get specific enough.
So I wouldn't have understood that through the agenda. So they'd be able to take the.
I think that's the important part that we want to
Helpful
cover
to understand.
with 2609 and implementing it. Is that's a important part of the EMR aspect, is that driver training, because Rachel, like you said, there's nothing in our regulatory structure now that requires drivers training. And even in the first responder education and training that was on the books before, it did not cover driver training the way that 2609 does.
So I think we need to be really clear about what we're talking about and why and for which purpose.
Just for clarification, that does make me a little bit, that does paint a clear picture of what you're looking for. And it does make me a little bit nervous. For most of the things that we've talked about here, I would say I agree with a lot of the comments online, a lot of the comments that Dr. Gaither made and Roy made and Todd, and I think everybody was chiming in. I do see that in some of these more rural environments that are struggling to staff emergency vehicles, that we could find ourselves in a situation where you have folks that don't have any driver training, that they're put in the front of an ambulance without any real driver training. And I appreciate Roy's point that for the most part, employers are going to protect themselves because they have the most to lose. But I'd almost argue that the people that are killed in a car accident end up with the most to lose. And I do think that there is value as a state agency to say there should be at least some level of minimum. Some level of minimum that says we have recognized the same way you check our ambulances with a fine tooth comb to make sure that it's meeting the standard. I think the person that's operating that ambulance should have some level of training to do it. So I already chimed in with my point that we won't do it with less than 40 hours in the city of Mesa. And I'm sure that there'll be all kinds of opinions that that's way too much to ask for an EMR, but 2 hours isn't enough either.
Just out of curiosity, how much does the SEVO course, sorry, I took SEVO, EVA courses cost? I mean, just like an initial training per employee or training the trainer, what's?
I don't, and Ron, or Ron Reed or Todd, we sent our train the trainer through the EVA course actually down in Yuma somewhere. And then they brought the trainer back because they became training instructors. So we don't charge.
I just was curious though, how much the initial outlay was.
I don't know.
That might be a deterrence to some of these smaller places that don't have a.
I don't know what we paid to get a train the trainer,
Okay.
but I can tell you what I charge to come. We don't charge anything. What we do is pray that they can bring an ambulance with them because that's where we struggled, is actually having enough vehicles for them to get driving time in. But if, to Roy's point, what we're looking for, if you guys are looking for a resource board, yeah, I can send you our list of every time we're teaching EVA, and it's being taught all over this valley all the time to make it a little bit easier to get folks into. I know that AMR has a pretty extensive, and I think they use EVA, but they have a pretty extensive driver program as well. But not that it's free. I don't know. I'm just saying we're not charging for that, but at some point there's a cost of doing business, whether it's a county, a municipal, or a private that's going to be providing that ambulance. We should have some level of some standard that says at least maybe 16 hours
And that is something that could be specified in the certification and training rules. If there were a certain number of hours to be prescribed, it would be most appropriate in, Ethan, correct me if I get this right or wrong, Articles 3 and 4, is that right?
I think
For certification and training?
3 is education and 4 is certification, if I remember right, yeah. Yeah, that's, ideally, we'd spell out the EMR training in 3, which should be education, to say what the program has to be composed of to likely get certified as an EMR. Because up until recently, we were recognizing that level of certification, but not actually certifying people at that level.
Is the intent to use the national standard of EMR? Or I don't know if it's a standard, but I know that others state.
National Registry has a certification level for EMR.
Is that what?
I added the NREMT link in the chat line, so you can look it up if you want to.
And that the national standard curriculum is available too at ems.gov.
My clients tell me, and more than one, that that NREMT EMR module or certification is a nightmare, and that it has a very high failure rate. And in fact, it's easier for them to put people through EMT certification for National Registry than EMR. So I would caution you about wholesale adopting the NREMT EMR certification as being some sort of proxy for doing it some other way.
The general criteria for the EMR program are spelled out in 2609, and the rules that will coincide with that are where the details are going to be spelled out. So if you're looking for what, generally speaking, an EMR program is going to be composed of, you can find that in the definition section of 2609.
And is that what we have displayed on the screen?
Yes, definition number 17. Now, I don't know if the new bill 1711 or whatever that other number was changes this, but this is what I remember in the 2609 bill.
The 1711 language is very similar. It's only slightly different under, I believe, 16. There's a slight difference. I believe 17 stays the same. And hearing the recommendations from this group as we start to think about what it looks like when we open up those rules and potentially prescribe really specific training requirements like the number of hours, that's very helpful. And I'm glad that we were able to pull this up to really show that and have that discussion. So I want to recap really quickly. I know we kicked off the discussion by saying that we were really looking for recommendations that this group could bring back to EMS Council in September. I think we got some really good feedback in terms of pulling together a resource page that could include examples of training, examples of policies, and potential public messaging that could be put forward. It is really timely to gather resources in the way that we've been talking about it as a group, because as we know, we saw the bills up on the screen. With those regulations going into effect, we will need to think about more specific requirements for, especially for driver training. That does not mean that we are skipping over all the recommendations and things that came to the forefront with respect to emergency medical dispatcher training and medical necessity for Code 3 responses. Certainly, we want to make sure we continue the dialogue on that, since we have data that shows that we want to consider safety in all responses across the state. I think we got some really good notes and a foundation to work off of from today to be able to start to pull together some recommendations, and the conversation does not have to end here. Or are you raising your hand?
Well, I just want to get some clarification, because you guys have used a lot of statistics that are showing that really we should be limiting our Code 3 responses. But I do think that somehow or another that has to tie into the CON, because we did try to, because we are of the same mindset that we are sending ambulances Code 3 on too many calls. And essentially the regulatory side of our CONs didn't allow us to, we wanted to stop dispatching ambulances code 3. But that could only happen with an upgrade from either the alarm room supervisor based on CAD comments and the triage, or from our captain reading comments to upgrade that ambulance, or what they get on scene to upgrade the ambulance. And
Corey, can I ask you, what about the CON kept that from happening?
I'm not, what you told me when I called you was that because of my reporting requirements, if I didn't have a code 3, if I didn't have calls that were code 3, then I couldn't report. So we called you, Ethan, to ask if we could move in the direction of no longer having code 3 initial dispatches. And we're told we couldn't. And every bit of the data that you guys have used to show that we're sending too many ambulances seems to support what we wanted to do.
Yeah, I think the timing is right on this one to be able to get some clarity around what the current rules say and then what the draft rules say. And the way that we've defined response mode or priority really does give the provider or the CON holder the onus to determine how to dispatch and which response mode is going to be used. I don't know if you want to offer any additional clarity around that.
Yeah, I think everyone is under the same impression that we should be using code 2s where appropriate as opposed to code 3s. Response times are measured in terms of compliance on code 3s only. If you have no code 3s, that just means there's nothing to measure. And if you've got none, then there's no response times to measure. It doesn't mean that you can't do all of your code calls code 2. It just means that for compliance purposes with your certificate of necessity, there would be nothing to measure. So
be good.
You could do that. There's nothing preventing you from doing it. Don't think that the CON prevents you from making sure what should be a code 2 and what should be a code 3. But for compliance purposes with the CON, when we look at response times, the only thing reasonable to measure with the way that they're structured currently is when you're using lights and sirens, which are supposed to be time sensitive calls, which is what those times are there for. If it's code 2 with no lights and sirens, the expectation would be it would take you longer, and therefore those times wouldn't apply. So I don't remember the discussion that you're referencing, and if there was some confusion about it, let's talk about it further, because if it's keeping you from using code 2s where appropriate, I think that's a discussion we should certainly be having again.
I like it.
I can appreciate what you were communicating, Corey, is that we can't look at these things in silos and that they're gonna, one impact the other, right?
Absolutely.
I can appreciate that.
No one wants to have code 3s happening that shouldn't be happening.
I like it.
Ethan, I think the confusion comes in if we look at the definitions in the proposed rules. It doesn't make that clear. It simply says an emergency response is something that requires, I believe, an immediate dispatch, and the other is a delayed dispatch. Well, in 911 calls, there's a lot of calls that people should appropriately respond on code 2, but all of them require an immediate response. So I think the ambiguity is in that language. It is not prescriptive enough. It's open to interpretation. I absolutely love the interpretation that you have, but it's my opinion that that needs to be codified so there's no ambiguity that somewhere else, when Ethan finally retires, that somebody else might interpret that, well, all those CON response times actually apply to code 2 calls as well. So.
Well, you just put a smile on my face. Can you tell me when you get the chance? I know it's a bigger discussion than for what this meeting allows for, but do you think that the current draft rules provide the specificity that you think are lacking in the current rules?
And you have 1 minute because we're
I can answer that with one word: no.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that these conversations really are incredibly timely because, as you all know, we have the rules open right now, and we are also looking forward to looking at certification and training rules specifically next. So this has been really helpful, and we want to start gathering some resources. I know we are at 3:30, so we will be doing some follow-up after this to get ready for EMS Council, and we will look forward to continuing these important conversations. Thank you, guys. Shelley, what do we need to do to close out?
I apologize for leaving so quickly. I've got a
Thank you,
3:30 I've
everybody.
got to get to.
But I've got him on recording, right?
Hold on.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Billy.